The question is, how do you differentiate the utility of behavioral / psychotherapeutic treatments for conditions like depression versus medical treatments? Okay, so the first thing I would say is, don't underestimate the utility of medical interventions. Depression is a catastrophe. It carries with it a very high suicide rate. And it also levels people out, and it's really hard on their families. And so, and it's physiologically extraordinarily damaging. And so, if you're in a depressive state and it's severe, you can try an antidepressant. You'll know in a month if it works. If it works, well, maybe it'll help you get your life together. Like we could say, well, maybe you're depressed because your life isn't very well together. Could be. Sometimes people are depressed, their life is just, it isn't fine, because no one's life is fine. Everyone's life is a tragedy. But sometimes people have their lives in order as much as you could expect anyone to have. They have friends, they have an intimate relationship, they have a career that they like. You know, they're qualified, industrious people working hard on what they're doing and really playing a minimum number of games with themselves, and they're terribly depressed. Antidepressant, man, sometimes that will just fix it. And so hooray, like you're a biological entity. If there's something out there that can help you strengthen yourself so that you can prevail, great. And you know, people, you hear everyone takes antidepressants, you know, everyone's taking them. It's like no one takes those bloody things without serious consideration. Half the time I spend with my clients who are depressed is often the 2 years long attempt to get them to tentatively try an antidepressant, because they're so guilty that they're relying on an external crutch to sort out their lives that they can't even tolerate it. But you know, I say, well look, man, what if you had diabetes? You're not going to take your insulin? It's like, you got stressed, you blew out at your weakest point. That's what happens when you get stressed. If there's something out there that might help you, it's like, try it, for God's sake. You'll know in a month, and you just stop if it doesn't work. Now, having said that, you want to do a multidimensional analysis. It's like, well, do you have any friends? Do you have an intimate relationship, or are you pursuing one? Do you have a reasonable career? Are you as educated as you are intelligent? Do you have something useful to do with your time outside of work? Do you have a drug or alcohol problem? Are there other behavioral issues like sleep dysregulation and lack of eating that are contributing to the pathology? You want to differentiate all of that, and wherever you can make a behavioral intervention, so much the better. But sometimes too, you're dealing with people whose lives are so wrecked that they don't even know where to start. They're different than the ones who have everything in order, say. And you say, well, try this, man, maybe you won't cut your throat in the next month, because if you're dead, it's going to be hard to work with you. And so medical interventions, anything. If you're sick, you do what is necessary to get better, and you leave your pride behind if you have to. And that says nothing about the utility of the behavioral interventions. You want to hit the problem with everything you have at your disposal. But some antidepressants, especially for people whose lives are together and who are depressed, antidepressants can be absolutely miraculous. So, you know, and you hear about the clinical evidence in their favor being iffy, and that's partly because the diagnosis of depression isn't very well formulated. It's very different to have a terrible life than to be depressed. And antidepressants can only help you so much if you have a terrible life. So, yeah. So if you don't move forward and you start to question the frame, that's way worse than merely not moving forward. You get a bad exam grade. What do you think? What the hell am I doing in university anyways? It's like, probably that's not the first place you should go with that piece of information. And you think, well, why? Why is that worse? Well, as far as I can tell, your map of you as a university student is a comprehensive representation. It tells you what you should do every day. It kind of tells you where you're going in the future. And if something emerges as an anomaly, you get a worse grade than you expected, and you blow that whole map, it's like, okay, what have you been doing for the last 4 years? What kind of high school student were you? How clueless are you about how you're arranging your future? What's your identity going to be if you're not going to be a student? Where are you going to end up in 5 years? It's like, so it's like that little grade, that bad grade is like a portal through which snakes can crawl. And that's exactly how you respond to it, especially if you open the door too much. Well, maybe this means that I shouldn't be in university. Well, one of the rules is you want to constrain the anomalous event to the minimal necessary domain. It's really, really important. You want to do that when you're arguing with your partner, which you'll do all the time. We have an argument. Well, I should never have married you. It's like, no, that's not the first response. That's a bad response. Or here's a really good one. You've always done that sort of thing, and you always will. It's like, oh good, great. It's like the only answer to that is to hit someone. Because like you're done, right? You're like that, you've always been like that. There isn't a chance that you can be repaired, and none of it is acceptable. It's like the person's going to fight with you right away, because what else are they going to do? So what you want to do is you want to minimize. It isn't rationalization. You want to say, okay, this person did something that disrupted our joint map. Okay, what's the smallest possible thing they could do to put it back together? And you have to know, well, we need to make a plan so you don't do it again. Or we need to have a discussion so that you know that it wasn't a good thing to do. But I'm not going to go after your whole character. I'm going to say, when I come home and you're watching TV, just come to the door and say hello. Not, don't you love me, or something like that. It's like, no, you just have to walk to the door and like give me a hug or something, and then that's good enough. And so then the other person might be able to tolerate that much corrective information, maybe, if you're kind of nice about it, and you also understand that they're probably going to have something equally horrible to say about you in the next 15 minutes, because you're going to do something stupid. So you don't want to open the door so that every possible snake comes crawling through, because that's a pathway to depression. And you actually see that happening in depressed people, is that every small event produces a cascade through their entire value system, and they end up saying, well, that's just another reason that I should jump off a bridge. And they really see it that way. It's really awful, because they've got no defenses. It's like, well, I didn't do so well in this course. It's like I'm going to get a bad mark in the exam. I'm going to get a bad mark in the course. That's going to screw up my ability to finish my degree. I'm never going to get into the field of my choice. It's just another piece of indication that I'm useless and that life isn't worthwhile. Bang, I'm going to jump off a bridge. And if you're really depressed, it's like each of those things hits you with the certainty of truth. It's really not good. And so you want to be careful. You want to be careful about walking down that pathway when you make a mistake. You think, okay, what's the narrowest framework of interpretation within which I can understand this that will require minimal behavioral change to decrease the probability that it will happen again? It's mental hygiene, fundamentally. Yes? Yeah. We'll get to that. We'll get to that. That is the next question. It's because they don't exist in isolation. So, and that's another thing frequently, when you hear behavioral accounts of cognitive processes, they generally only focus on as if it's an isolated thing. It's not. It's scalable. It's scalable a bunch of ways. It's scalable temporally, because what you do now is associated with what you'll do tomorrow, and that with what you'll do next week, and so forth. So it has to be scalable temporally. And it's also scalable socially, right? So it has an effect on you, that has an effect on your family, that has an effect on the community, and so forth. And so you don't want to it's very difficult to think through the effect of your action on all those scaling levels simultaneously, but you have mechanisms that allow you to do that. And see, I think that the sense of, let's assume that you're not lying to yourself constantly, so your head isn't full of chaos and garbage, and you have reasonable relationships with people in the world. I think that, and this is leaping way ahead, I think that your sense of meaningful engagement with what you're doing is the psychophysiological marker that you're acting in a way that takes all of the stacked representations into account simultaneously. Because you're trying to figure out where you are. And you might think, well, that means where I am in this room. But look, this room is not a simple thing, right? It's nested. It's a subset of the university. That's a subset of society. It's a subset of your life. The room is a complicated thing. And you need to figure out where you should be in the room. And you can't do that surely with perception, because all you see is me and some of the wall, right? You've got this little narrow portal, and so you can't really rely on your perceptions to orient you. But you do orient yourself, and I think what you do is it's engagement. It's like, does this seem meaningful and deep and engaging? Yes. Then it's an indication that it's serving multiple masters simultaneously. So maybe both socially and also temporally. And so I think the sense of meaning is actually an instinct that orients people in time and space. It's not an epiphenomenon. It's the most fundamental form of perception. And that's the only optimistic thought that I've ever been able to derive from psychology, is that that actually could be true. It could be that the sense of meaning is an orienting reflex. And that would be wonderful if it was true, because it would make it real, you know. And it's one of the, you know, one of the devastating elements of nihilism is something like, well, who the hell cares what you're doing? What difference is it going to make in a million years? It's like your sense of meaning is just an illusion. You know, you're a limited creature in a limited place, and nothing you do really matters. It's like, that's a powerful argument, especially if you're an objective materialist and a reductionist. It's a killer argument, but it looks to me like it's wrong. It's actually wrong, because meaning looks to me like it's an actual phenomenon. It does say that you're positioned properly between chaos and order, or something like that. It's real. So, well, so we'll see. We're going to develop that argument, because if it's real, you want to know that, because it gives you something to stand on. You know, maybe it's as real as pain, but it's not pain, it's something positive, and you need something positive that you can rely on. All right, so, and the psychoanalysts, I think, err too much on the side of the subject. They tend to think that too much of you is inside of you, and too little of you is outside of you. And part of the reason I believe that is because of my clinical experience. I love the psychoanalysts, man. They're brilliant, they're deep. They grapple with real problems, like with the problems, when people have real problems, and I mean profound problems, they're really profound moral problems. They're problems of good and evil, really. You know, there are things going on in their family that are so terrible that, well, that they're sometimes fatal, you know. Lie upon lie upon lie upon lie for decades and decades and decades. It's awful. And that's not exactly inside them. It's out there in the world. And lots of the people that I see, very famous critic of psychology, I can't remember his name, but I probably will, criticized the practice of psychology quite effectively I believe in the early 60s. The Myth of Mental Illness by Thomas Szasz, S-Z-A-S-Z. It's a classic. You should read it. If you're interested in psychology, read it. Like, it's a classic. And he basically said, most people have problems in living, they don't have psychological problems. And so I've experienced, despite my love for the psychoanalysts, very frequently what I'm doing as a therapist is helping people have a life that would work. You know, and you can parameterize that. It's like, what do you need? How about some friends? That people kind of like that. How about an intimate relationship with someone that you can trust, that maybe has a future? That'd be good. How about a career that puts you in a dominance hierarchy somewhere, so at least you've got some possibility of rising, some possibility of stabilizing yourself, and a schedule and a routine, because no one can live without a routine. You just forget that. If you guys don't have a routine, I would recommend, like, you get one going, because you cannot be mentally healthy without a routine. You need to pick a time to get up. Whatever time you want, but pick one and stick to it, because otherwise you dysregulate your circadian rhythms and they regulate your mood. And eat something in the morning. I've had lots of clients who've had anxiety disorders. I had one client who was literally starving. Very smart girl. There was very little that she liked. She kind of tried to subsist on like half a cup of rice a day. She came to me and said, I have no energy. I come home, all I want to do is watch the same movie over and over. What, like, is that weird? And I thought, well, it depends how hard you work. You know, it's a little weird, but whatever. It's familiar. You're looking for comfort. So I did an analysis of her diet. It's like 3/4 of a cup of rice. It's like, you're starving. Eat something. You know, you'll feel better. So she modified her diet, and all her anxiety went away, and she had some energy. It's like, yeah, you gotta eat. So a schedule, that's a good thing, man. Your brain will thank you for it. It will stabilize your nervous system. With a bit of a plan, that's a good thing. You need a career, you need something productive to do with your time, you need to regulate your use of drugs and alcohol, most particularly alcohol, because that does in a lot of people. You need a family, like the family you have, your parents and all that. It'd be nice if you all got along, you could work on that, that's a good thing to work on. And then, you know, you probably need children at some point, and that's life. That's what life is. And if you're missing, you know, you may have a good reason to not be operating on one of those dimensions. It's not mandatory, but I can tell you that if you're not operating reasonably well on 4, I think I mentioned 6, if you're not operating reasonably well on at least 3 of them, there's no way you're going to be psychologically thriving. And that's more pragmatic in some sense than psychological, right? Human beings have a nature, there's things we need. And if we have them, well, that's good. And if we don't have them, well, then we feel the lack. And so behaviorists, behavioral psychologists concentrate a lot more on that sort of thing. You know, it's practical. It's like strategizing. Make a career plan. Figure out how to negotiate, because that's bloody important. Figure out how to say what you need. Figure out how to tell the truth to people. Figure out how to listen to your partner in particular, because if you listen to them, they will actually tell you what they want. And sometimes you can give it to them, and maybe they'll return the favor. And if you practice that for like 15 years, well, then maybe you're constantly giving each other what you want. Well, hooray, that would be good. And then there's 2 of you under both circumstances, and it's better to have 2 brains than 1, because people think differently because of their temperament mostly. And so the negotiation is where the wisdom arises, and it's part of the transformation, the psychological transformation that's attendant on an intimate relationship, and one of the fundamental purposes of a long-term intimate relationship.